Hello and welcome everybody to our Wednesday session at Change11. We have the great privilege again to have Howard Rheingold with us. Yesterday we had an excellent session where we talked about the 5 literacies for social media, required for social media, which was excellent and available on change.mooc.ca. If you're willing, if you want to go back and review that session, it's well worth the time. Today we're going to have a bit more of an open session where we don't really have an agenda. We just come together with our ideas and our questions and our thoughts around the work that Howard has done, and hope that we'll have a really interesting discussion. My pleasure once again to welcome Howard Rheingold. How are you today, Howard?
Sorry, I spent part of the morning going through some of the links in the daily, and there was an interesting blog post by Andrew, I'm sorry I forget his last name, that was calling attention to what I had said about Nicholas Carr in particular, and Sherry Turkle. And as I said, this is the first time I've presented this, so I need to really hone how I'm wording that. I did not mean to say that there is not evidence for their positions. I think that they would agree that the issue of whether the kinds of changes that use of digital media apparently are affecting on people's brains are necessarily detrimental. Carr makes an argument that they are. I think he's talking about a 20th century context, and he really doesn't get into the issue of what would be the difference if we could learn how to use these media in what we define to be an effective manner. And of course that definition is really open to a lot of arguments. Is productivity the main goal? Sometimes being scattered is a way of seeing the whole system. It's a way of learning. So I think that there's some context involved there, but I also think that there's a lot of learning involved there, and he particularly cited Cliff Nass's research. I've talked to Cliff Nass about that research. His office is just down the block, down the hall from mine at Stanford, and remember that his research on multitasking, which does present very strong evidence that people who think they're good multitaskers are actually bad multitaskers, in the sense that they lose effectiveness in the component tasks that they're doing when they try to task switch among a number of different tasks. But I raised 2 points about that. One, and Cliff would agree with me about this, necessarily his experimentation was kind of a toy experiment. People are paying attention to red rectangles and green, red circles and green rectangles, and trying to ignore these circles while remembering which position the rectangles are in. And I think this is a very different situation from someone who has multiple streams coming in that all are relevant to each other. So when I'm writing a book, yes, I'm concentrating on my word processing, but I may also have a search query out in another window. I may also turn to people in a social network via Twitter or other social networks via another window. I may have multiple windows that are all relevant to the task. Nobody that I know of has actually done research on multitasking involving relevant media. That's the first point. The second point is that in NASA's research and other multitasking research, which is pretty much shows that people who think they are getting things done more efficiently by multitasking actually are not. And I don't disagree with that conclusion. There's a percentage, around 5% of people are actually able to multitask effectively. They're able to task switch without paying a high switching cost. So the question there, which I raised yesterday, is, do these people have just an innately different kind of nervous system that enables them to do that, or have they somehow stumbled upon, learned to do something that we might learn how to do better? So I'm not making an argument. I'm saying that the argument that digital media are inevitably detrimental to people's thinking is a self-fulfilling prophecy if you were to assume that it is true. If you are to assume that maybe you could improve your ability to attend, you can improve your critical consumption, your other capabilities, and thus be able to be engaged in digital media in a more informed way, you know, that might be wrong, but there's a chance that it's right. So I'm steering away from the determinist position about digital media until proved otherwise. So, and in responding to Andrew's post, I don't see him online at the moment, I dug up a really interesting study. Does everybody know about the selective inattention test? The video where people are asked to count the number of times that the people in the white jerseys bounce their basketballs. The girl. Well, I don't want to make a spoiler here. Let me, for those of you who have not yet seen this, that's the video. It's only a minute and a half long, and it's pretty interesting. I'm going to give you a second to take. Oh, hi, I see Nancy White is online. Hi, Nancy. Thanks for the advice. I'm going to go back through the chat a little bit in case anybody wants to look at this 1 minute. I think it's a minute and a half video before I go on about it. Okay, Joe Dillon asked about productivity not being my God, right? It characterizes as a 20th century ideal. Well, is focusing the only thing that is worthwhile doing, or are there worthwhile ways to pay attention to a lot of different things, the way we're doing right now? For example, I refuse to pathologize my attention. I'm not going to say that I have ADD. My attention is all over the place. It always has been all over the place. I had a hard time in school. I felt then, although I wasn't able to articulate it well, and I still feel that maybe some people, maybe many people, simply aren't comfortable learning by being squeezed into a little chair that they're supposed to sit in for 8 hours a day when you're 8 years old. I was given a lot of tests. They did not have medications back then, or I would have been medicated. So I know that my attention is all over the place. I've written a dozen books. Is that good enough for you? Does that mean that I therefore pass the productivity test? I can focus. I choose not to focus a lot. I'm not sure that that's wrong. I'm not sure that the kind of reading linked attentional skills that Carr concentrates on are necessarily the ones that humans ought to have. It's an open question. Maybe I could be convinced otherwise. Okay. Yes. So mindfulness. I think one of the things that you learn when you sit down and meditate regularly is that your thoughts are all over the place. You don't have to have a disorder to have your thoughts jump from the thought of a memory to an anticipation of the future to noticing something in your body to being distracted by a sound outside. That's kind of the natural state of people's attention. And of course, teachers of mindfulness say that. I'm sorry. What was that?
I don't know where that sound came from, but it was an ideal exclamatory on the point you were making.
Okay. So back to focus here. Reflective practice, metacognition, mindfulness, whatever you call it. I think it's clear that there are ways to train this, and in the book I cite a lot of the literature around the neuroscience and the cognitive science of mindfulness, and and metacognition, and it's pretty clear that people can improve their performance on a number of cognitive tests by training their attention to some degree. So anyway, now that I've let a little bit of time go by to give people the opportunity to see the invisible gorilla, I actually was one of those people who did not see the gorilla the first time. But there's some interesting recent research that seems to indicate that people who are high multitaskers are better. They may be worse at their individual performance on their tasks, but they seem to be better at seeing the gorilla. So here's one reference. If you want the formal reference, it's this one. And of course, I'm necessarily oversimplifying that. But I think there's a lot more work to be done. I'm a big believer in evidence-based arguments, but also necessarily social psychology experiments concentrating on a fairly narrow range of consciousness. Isn't it more of a question of focus, not multitasking, says Lisa. Well, so this multitasking, one of the things that the multitasking studies reveal is that people don't really multitask very well. What we do is we task switch, and there's a cost associated with switching from one task to another task and then back to the original task again. It takes a little while to get up to speed. Some people have much lower switching costs than others, but most people have fairly high switching costs, so that our effectiveness at each of the component tasks appears to be diminished when we're doing a lot of different tasks. I think it depends a lot on the task. As I mentioned before, aviation necessarily requires very rapid task switching. You need to navigate, communicate, and aviate in 3 dimensions simultaneously, and that's if nobody is shooting at you while you're doing it. So this flexibility, I think it's fairly clear that human attention has innate limitations. I don't think it's clear what those limitations are, and I don't think it's clear how far we can push them. One of the books that was very influential to me was Proust and the Squid. By Marianne Wolf, who studied reading, and there's also a book on reading and the brain by Dahane, which both of those, if somebody looks those up and drops the URLs into the chat, it would be useful. From those, I learned that reading really is a method of rewiring the brain's cognitive capacities through training. Humans come with some biological capabilities that have evolved for various reasons. We are able to very quickly abstract the meaning from a primitive visual symbol, for example, and it has been hypothesized that comes from looking at a track on the ground and determining very quickly whether that's something that might eat us and therefore we should run, or whether that's something we might eat and therefore we should run after it. That's our ability to recognize letters may be based on some of the primitives in our visual system that may have evolved for that reason. Humans are capable of mentally rehearsing and sequencing a great many things. That's why I'm able to start a sentence without knowing where the sentence ends and put the words together on the fly. We're able to abstract meaning from symbols. All of these biological capabilities evolved for different reasons, but we have exacted them, and exaptation is a good word, I think, to use there, to read. So if we all learned to read, remember what it was like? We learned the alphabet by rote. We learned to put letters together and sound them out and recognize what they meant until eventually we didn't have to do that. We could just look at a word and know what it meant. It takes years of doing that, and what it requires is coordinating brain functions that are not naturally coordinated. We are not naturally, innately equipped to read. You need to coordinate those different brain functions, recognizing visual primitives, sequencing, abstracting. You need to tie those together. You need to practice it and practice it and practice it. It's the neurons or nerve networks that fire together, wire together. So there's, I think, there's a large body of literature about the cognitive differences between literates and illiterates, and between people who use alphabetic languages and people who use ideographic languages. There's evidence that we can train our attention and rewire our nervous systems that way.
Howard, this is Dave Corney here. I'd like to ask a question if you don't mind.
Please.
If we pull together sort of some of the stuff that you're saying in terms of, you said Carr might be talking about a 20th century model. What do you think, and I always think when we have this discussion about adaptation, about the perhaps not quite true idea of how color blindness was helpful in seeing through camouflage when hunting. I don't know if that's true, and I've seen both sides of that argument, but that kind of biological adaptation versus 20th century to 21st, which is clearly not an evolutionary leap. But what do you think, are there more places for, as you say, you think of things in different ways and maybe you don't fit into the sit and focus in a traditional sense, but you found a lot of successes using your skills and strengths. Do you think that we're splintering out with a lot of different kinds of roles, or has that always been true and we just haven't valued them in that way?
Well, there are a number of questions embedded there. I want to get to the splintering out, but I want to note that one of the things that Marianne Wolf noted in Proust and the Squid, she studies reading disorders. Reading disorders are multifold. There's not one kind of reading disorder. It has to do with an inability to do one of the different kinds of cognitive processing that come together with reading. So she asked the question, why is there a percentage of the population that seems to continue whose cognitive wiring is a little bit different? They find it harder to learn how to read. And she posits that one of the kind of meta tracks of evolution is that a species needs to have a pool of different capabilities so that when the environment changes rapidly, there would be, maybe in a situation being colorblind is very useful. There needs to be a pool of individuals who differ from the norm so that those individuals will be uniquely adapted to a different situation. And of course, if you think in a Darwinian manner, they're going to reproduce more effectively, and generations hence there will be more people in the population who have that capability. And we've seen that there is evidence of human evolution continuing into fairly recent times, biologically speaking. The ability to the capacity to digest milk, the presence of the enzyme that digests non-human milk, is associated with populations that have raised cattle, for example. So I think that we may be in a very rapidly changing environment cognitively. I don't think that anybody has a doubt that 2 billion, going on 3 billion people on the internet, 5 billion mobile phones, that our symbiosis with our devices and the attention we pay to those devices and the access to others and the access to media and knowledge that those devices give is a rapidly changed environment. Maybe some of us whose attention isn't quite suited for the 20th century schoolroom are well adapted to this environment. There are things to learn from the outliers in that regard. So I want to go back to your question about splintering. I may have gotten that wrong, and if so, please clarify it. But one thing that's happened that I think is both marvelous and a challenge is that literacy, learning to read and write alphabetically, was a great way to raise the collective intelligence of a population. You could assume that with education, using the word education rather than schooling, that most of the people in the population are able to share in literacy. And as I said at the very beginning, literacy is not just about encoding and decoding. It's about that skill introducing you and enabling you to participate in a community of literates. Now we are seeing the proliferation of multiple literacies, and I'm talking about a few of them here, but if you're just talking about media literacies, there are people who are really great at making videos. We've got people who are really good at using short form text forms. People are, I'm afraid, fragmenting into a lot of different kinds of literacies, and there will necessarily be a smaller portion of the population who's going to master all of them. I think we can raise that collective IQ. We can raise the portion of the population who have at least elementary skills in many of these. But the era that Carr laments, in which there was a single focus on reading and writing literacy, I think for better and for worse is gone. We have a lot of different focuses. I don't think we're going to go back. And you know what? We might have been better off in many ways with only a single literacy. But I think also there's Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences and other evidence that people learn in different ways. So maybe we are now affording opportunities to people who may not have been able to shine if reading and writing was the sole criterion for judging your participation in the community of literacy. Now, people who may not be that great at writing may be very good at creating a video or a PowerPoint presentation. Are they any less legitimate than others? Did that adequately address your question, Dave, or did you have more?
I think that adequately required. I mean, it's one of those things, and as you say, and I really enjoy I really like your position. I'm not saying that Carr and Turkle are in any way wrong. I'm just saying the jury's still out. And I think anytime you get into this nature-nurture debate, you end up kind of tangled a little bit, because it's tough to say that, you know, there are new literacies developed, or maybe they were, you know, less mainstream and they're coming to the middle. I think, you know, painters and artists who, you know, historically had to have huge access to resources in order to be able to express themselves, whereas now that could be a little bit more broadly done. But no, that addresses it perfectly.
Well, you touched upon a particular sensitivity here. My mother was an art teacher, and if you were a troublemaker, either you were really smart or you were just really trouble, they sent you to the art room. And I was fortunate that my mother was the art teacher in my school, and her philosophy was not to teach technique, but to teach permission. That she believed that being able to express yourself creatively using multiple materials is an innate human need, and it's something that gives people pleasure. But almost always people are shut down pretty early. Someone looks at your drawing and says, well, your cat doesn't look very much like a cat, or your horse doesn't look like a horse. You better leave the drawing to the artists. And we get shut down, and we feel that we are, quote, not artists, and therefore not able to express ourselves visually. I couldn't do a great job drawing a cat that looks like a cat, or a horse that looks like a horse, but I do a lot of painting, and it's very meaningful to me and gives me pleasure, and I think it exercises a part of my brain that I don't necessarily exercise when I'm speaking or writing, and I think that it feeds the other parts of my consciousness as well. So, you know, I think that I'm one of those people who believes that art is important in the schools, and it's important in the schools for exactly the reasons I'm talking about here, that it's a way of exercising your brain that is not fit into those, well, McLuhan would say that print is a very linear, industrial way of thinking. And of course, Kathy Davidson expands upon that in her book about attention. Now you see it. I think we're probably talking a lot about attention here. Other literacies certainly are important as well. What's interesting about arts of the hand and arts of the mind, I think that for example, the ability to touch a screen rather than type into it is a dramatic change, and that there are a lot of people who weren't able to use computation or computational-based media before, who are able to express themselves in ways that they weren't before, because they can now use their fingers directly. So Michael asked a question about reading, writing is the meaning for learning in a political economic choice. Boy, that's a good question. You know, of course, the Middle Ages, the priest held the book, there was one church. The Protestant Reformation, of course, had a great deal to do with reading and writing. The theology of the Reformation was that instead of the Bible being mediated by the church, you had to go to the priest to have the priest read the Bible to you. That individuals and households and congregations should have their own Bibles. They should read and interpret for themselves. That was not only a theological assertion; it was a media assertion, and it came. And Luther nailed his 95 Theses up on the cathedral door, presumably handwritten in the late 15th century, or about the same time that printers were looking for new markets. There were actually hundreds of thousands of printed copies of those 95 Theses that were available within a few years. So Elizabeth Eisenstein, if you're really interested in getting into this question of the political implications, the cultural implications, the printing press as an agent of change, I think is the title of the book, something very, very close to that. There were a lot of different factors involved in the rise of print, but clearly this theological dispute, the Reformation, had a great deal to do with it, and that was, of course, political, decentralizing the power of the church to the congregations and fragmenting what had been the universal, the Catholic Church into many different churches was deeply tied up with that. I'm really interested in the history of print. I get into it when I talk to journalists about the public sphere. The history of the media, the newspapers, and the other democratic media that gave rise to democracy, I think is a very interesting one to pay attention to now that we are seeing a change to a new medium. I've got a little mini course on that. I'm looking that up. See if I can find that. Yeah, here it is. So I get into a lot of detail in this here. By the way, can somebody answer a question for me, which is that until a few days ago, I was able to type a search query into the address bar of my Chrome browser, and now it's changed. I type something in there, and if it's not a URL, it sends me to Google, and I have to retype it over again. Has anybody else experienced that? I know Nancy mentions Linda Stone. Linda Stone was a great inspiration and source for my book, and I interviewed her and quote her extensively in my chapter on attention, and her work on email apnea is, I think, particularly important. I talked yesterday about one of the things to do with your attention online is to notice your breathing.
Let's say, Howard, I've been thinking about my breathing all day. Thanks for that. I wonder, there's a question that Chris 2B asked, and I don't want to get it lost starting to scroll up the page here. You spoke yesterday of cultivating social capital and commented on not knowing how to change education. Do you think that it's so hard to help teachers as a group become more web literate because teaching is by nature more conservative and teachers feel they have little power to contribute change?
Well, notice I said education, which to me connotes an institution rather than learning, which connotes a process. And I don't think that teachers are inevitably conservative, but I believe that public education is inevitably a conservative institution. You know, Neil Postman and Charlie Weingarten in teaching as a subversive activity get into that. And Postman makes a good point that if you live in a society that doesn't change very much, the function of education is to teach the new generation what the older generation knows about getting along in that society. When you live in a society that changes very rapidly, the purpose of education is to teach people how to learn in a rapidly changing society. So I think we're experiencing that shift. Again, Kathy Davidson and many others talk about the 19th and 20th century model of the schoolroom, the industrial model of the schoolroom. It necessitates, as I said, my mother was a teacher, just crowd control necessitates a certain kind of teaching. It's very hard to individualize it when you're dealing with that many students at a time. But also, schools and school boards, at least in the USA, are pretty conservative, that people don't want to see radical change. This whole issue of media literacy was raised in the 1960s about teaching children how to watch television, for example, how to distinguish between a commercial and non-commercial content. That was very widely resisted as being anti-American, downright communist. So I think there's a lot of political resistance to a lot of change in the classroom. And why should a teacher be required to learn a whole new skill set if they're not being paid anymore for it? They only have so many hours in the day. So I think that there are a lot of converging problems that have to do with the education system. If you want to get really radical about it, you can go to Ivan Illich, whose book, Deschooling Society. Yes, always with the communism. You know, I say this because my mother got in a lot of trouble for teaching things that were not political at all. Phoenix, Arizona in the 1950s and the 1960s was a pretty conservative place. Maybe I'm wrong, but of course in the USA we've got a battle to keep Darwin in the classroom in a lot of states. So maybe I'm not wrong, but Illich makes the case that schooling teaches compliance, and that learning ought to be broken out of the classroom. You know, I think in many ways that was impractical until very recently, but with the resources that we've got available now, we've got a lot of self-learners out there who may not do as well in the classroom, but who are able to connect with each other, able to connect with teachers, who are able to connect with resources online. I think we're just beginning to explore how to do that. We're doing that right now. As I said, I'm stumped by how we're going to change our educational institutions rapidly enough to deal with the changes that are coming in the world, and I'm skeptical of throwing technology at the problem. I'm sure that this is a pretty sophisticated group. Everybody here knows what I'm talking about. There's a lot of magical thinking that if you give everybody a laptop and you make all the teachers use PowerPoint, that suddenly magically the problems of the education system are going to disappear. I think that that's, not only is that not true, but I think that it's an obstacle to actually introducing helpful uses of technology in the classroom. Today's New York Times had an article about a teacher in Idaho who's resisting the changes there, and it's a pretty well-reasoned article, and I pretty much agree with that teacher that I want to teach my way. I think that just adding laptops and doing that by taking money away from teachers is not the way to do it. I also thought that it was a bit of a one-sided article, and I thought this has got to be a Matt Richtel article, and by golly, I went back to page 1, and it was a Matt Richtel article. And I'm glad that Matt Richtel presents his points of view, and he's a good reporter, but he's essentially the guy who covers digital media are bad for us. And to some degree, that's true. But I think the issue is making teachers make the choice between having a decent salary and having technology in the classroom, not whether technology in the classroom is effective. Joe says, I think that technology can help us look closely at network principles, can help change the ed system. I recognize a number of names here of people I know to be educators who are doing wonderfully innovative things. Rather than thinking about changing the system from the top down, I'm thinking about empowering those educators and networking those educators and enabling us to spread the word about best practices, enabling other educators, teachers, and librarians to get up to speed on some of the best ways to use technology in learning. So instead of a frontal assault on let's change the school system, I'm for finding the enthusiasts and connecting them and empowering them.
I think to some degree success is going to be the marker of any of this stuff working. And you need to have those first educators on the ground who know what to do and are successful with these new approaches. And then you have some chance of actually forming the change.
Well, of course, how you define success is really important. Is it success on standardized tests? Maybe people are better at coping in a rapidly changing environment. They're better at learning how to learn, and not necessarily any better at standardized tests. I'm posing that as a question because I don't know that for sure. I was really good at standardized tests. I was so good at standardized tests and I thought I was a lot smarter than I actually am for a long time before I figured out that there are a lot of other ways to be smart than acing tests. I think the same thing is true of people who are not that great at standardized tests. My daughter, who's very, very bright, I had to teach her how to do a test because she took the first problem and she worked it until she got it right. And then she got the second problem and she worked it until she got it right. Given enough time, my daughter would get 100% on the test. That's not how standardized tests works. It's certainly not how the SAT works. So I taught her, look, go answer all the easy ones first. Everything you know how to answer without thinking about it very much, go answer those. Then identify the ones that are really difficult and flag them for later and tackle the ones in the middle next. And so that's just really a strategy. It doesn't really test what you know, it tests what you know about taking a test. So again, I think how you define success is really important. And I think you can tell I'm the product of a small liberal arts college. I'm a big believer in learning to learn and lifelong learning. I'm sure anybody who's participating in this believes as well. That's not the universal belief. There's I think pretty widespread majority belief that there is a set of skills that need to be imparted and people need to be tested on those skills, and that's the sole criterion for judging the success of education.
I forget who it was a colleague of mine who said a couple of years ago, and I keep repeating it, never remembering who said it, that we're best preparing this school, this group of students for the Industrial Revolution. Because there were a set number of skills.
Yes, and the standardized test is very much like working on an assembly line. So the tailorization, the fragmentation of labor into parts, and treating humans more like machine parts, all of that has to do with the industrial mindset. And McLuhan talks about that a great deal in drawing the analogy between the linearity of type and the linearity of the assembly line. And of course, now we're in a much more fluid, rapidly changing, multidimensional situation. We're seeing a lot of American graduates or graduates of this kind of westernized schooling kind of floundering and trying to find a way to compete. And it's interesting that so many of the great entrepreneurs are dropouts. I don't think that that's causative. I don't think that being a dropout is going to make you into a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs. But I do think that people who are capable of grasping what is coming rather than what we've been given often find themselves somewhat at odds with the schooling system. So someone said, lines, what about circles? You know, one of the things I stumbled upon, of course I didn't invent this, and once I learned by stumbling on things and then looking them up. And of course Harrison Owen has done a great deal with circles, but I found that in the classroom when I asked the students to move their chairs from rows and columns into a circle, it had just an explosive effect on conversation and attention. And that's how the open, Harrison Owens, Nancy, what is it, the open, I'm using the word open space technology. It is a very effective way of having a kind of emergent learning, because there are no back rows in circles, and you're looking at each other. Connectivism in the classroom, absolutely. You know, I try to tell the students that absorbing everything that I am making available to them is not the goal, but working together to make sense of it, and working with me to make sense of it. Making connections between things is more important. That's one of the reasons I ask the students to do mind maps as part of the class. In fact, I've made public, with their permission, the mind maps the students in my social media class made, and if you give me a second, I'll find that for you. You know, this is just one technique for breaking out of that kind of linear banking model of delivering knowledge and looking at a more connectivist knowledge of that has to do with how are things connected to one another and how do you make sense of them. Hierarchical educational philosophies. I don't know. I do know that it's scary and difficult for a teacher to give up power to the students. It's very rewarding once you do it. Of course, you have to give responsibility as well. So I give the students the power to teach. I also give them the responsibility to learn. And I'm not abandoning them. I am in there helping them with that. But no longer can they count on coming into the classroom and passively sponging up what I am feeding them. They need to actively participate in the teaching as well as the learning, and I find it to be very rewarding. I remember how scary it was. So I think anybody in authority, in a hierarchy, is frightened of the consequences of voluntarily giving up some of their power. I think that's part of the answer to that question.
So when we started out here, Howard, yesterday you said you'd do a half an hour or 45 minutes. I love the fact that you hung on a lot longer. Do you want to finish on the hour?
No, I don't want to let important questions go unaddressed. So, Dave, if you've been keeping track of them, or if somebody has a question that they've asked upstream in the chat that I've missed, why not?
Well, why don't we put a call out for our last couple of questions from folks and see what comes up. I think the chat room has gone sideways on us, which it tends to do, and which one of my favorite things about this is that sometimes you end up with two separate sessions going on where there's a discussion in the chat room and they both sort of overlap, which is kind of nice. A classic Nancy White question. I meant sideways in the nicest possible way, Lisa. I meant that in a really positive way. It sort of slanted off in a new direction, making new connections, creating connected knowledge. So.
I'm hoping that someone is going to, as they did yesterday, retrieve the URLs from this chat and post them, maybe with a little bit of context. I will read the daily and spend some time tomorrow learning from that. If any of you have blogs that show up in the daily, I will try to take a little bit of time I'm looking over at my calendar here. Tomorrow I'm going to start teaching one of my Rheingold U courses, so I don't know how much time I will have, but I will try eventually to address everything that people address to me. How transferable are social skills in face-to-face environments to those online? You know, I think that there's a really good question there. I think that it is inappropriate to spend the vast majority of your time socializing online if you are 14 years old. You need to spend some time learning to socialize face-to-face. I think with many 14-year-olds, I was probably one of them, your face-to-face environment may be kind of hostile to you. High schools are notoriously hostile to a lot of people who are more interested in learning than they are in basketball. So I think it's easy to spend your social life online when you're young and you're interested in learning. I think it's important to spend some time with the face-to-face skills. How transferable are social skills in face-to-face environments? I think you need to have some basic respect for others and some listening skills in order to be able to thrive online. Can you learn those online? I'm not sure. I think most of what you need to learn through your parents and your peers before you end up in school. It's good observation by Lisa, those diagnosed with Asperger's. I think, so the word neuronormative is being used by people with Asperger's and other syndromes on the autistic spectrum to refer to people who believe that the normal, in the sense of the center of the curve, defines the range of human attentiveness.
Question that I saw earlier on, Howard, in that, what's the role of the learner inside of a traditional educational classroom that maybe can help them engage in this a little bit better?
Well, they need to pay attention, or they're not going to do very well, and they need to be able to participate when they're called upon. However, I think that those are essential in any classroom. I don't think it's enough. I think that just being really good at taking notes and acing the test is not going to be effective in this changing environment, which you need to learn how to ask questions and learn things. And I think being able to perform for the teacher is not as useful in an environment where there's so much peer-to-peer learning involved. Okay, did I ever meet a normal person? I felt that everybody but me was normal when I was in grade school. That's sort of the way I was led to believe. I think a lot of people are led to believe that. I'm a survivor of the school system. And I give my parents all the credit for saying that it's not my problem, it's the system's problem. It took me a long time to understand that. Okay, so I guess that wraps it up. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for everything you've put into the chat that I'm going to absorb later. And I guess that's all. You all know where to find me.
Yeah, I'd just like to thank you for coming out 2 days in a row. And we've got a book you're trying to get finished and stuff that you're ready for lots of work on your desk. But I'm glad you could focus some of your attention our way for a couple of hours this week, and hope that the experience has been good for you too. Because I think, from my point of view, with I found having the MOOC go after my work for a week really helpful. And I hope you have the same experience this week too.
Thank you, Dave. How could anybody who is interested in learning and technology and media not participate in a MOOC? So this has been a great learning experience for me, and I will continue to follow it. Thank you very much.